Coming up on the Author's Den, an interview with Tom Stanton, author of Hank Aaron and the Home Run That Changed America.
Welcome to the Author's Den, a place where we encourage reading and writing, a place where you can meet authors and book illustrators, a place to get your questions answered about writing, publishing, and promoting your book. Coming up on the Author's Den, an interview with Tom Stanton, author of Hank Aaron and the Home Run That Changed America. Well, hello and welcome to the Author's Den. Today my guest is author Tom Stanton. He's written a book called The Final Season, The Road to Cooperstown, and your new book,
Hank Aaron and the Home Run That Changed America.
Well, thanks for being with us today.
My pleasure.
Tell us a little bit about yourself.
Yeah, I'm a journalist of 25 years. Grew up in Michigan, Warren, and used to own newspapers in Macomb and St. Clair counties, based in New Baltimore, the Voice newspapers. Been an author for the past 5 or 6 years and just having a great life.
So Tom, as a child, what role did reading play for you?
A huge role. You learn so much just from reading in terms of writing. You read other writers and it just sort of permeates your being. You can learn to write really by reading others. I was a huge sports fan, and so for a lot of boys especially, sports are the entree into reading. You start with the sports pages, you expand to magazines and books, and that's how it was for me, and it was out of enjoyment. I was obsessed with baseball as a kid, and so this gave me a great way to start out.
When you look back at your life as a child, do you have any favorite books, favorite authors that come to mind?
You know, probably more later on. I certainly read, when I was a kid, all of the usual sports biographies of Gordie Howe and Al Kaline and Willie Horton, things of that nature. But later on, is, in terms of the classics, Mark Twain. In terms of more contemporary writers, a guy named Willie Morris, who is a Mississippi-based writer, is my favorite writer. And just a wide variety, really. I tend to focus now on nonfiction and essays and memoir.
Talk about your first book, The Final Season. Other than baseball, what's the book really about?
It's about a whole lot more than baseball, even though the whole story revolves around baseball. It's The Final Season is a memoir of the last year at Tiger Stadium, but it revolves around my relationship with my father and my sons and our family, spending much of 9 decades at that ballpark through 4 generations of our family. And it's about coming to terms with the death of a place, and metaphorically the future passing of my father. The book did very well. It won the Casey Award for Best Baseball Book of the Year in 2002, and it's been optioned for film, so hopefully we'll see it on the screen someday.
Nice.
But I felt compelled in that final year of Tiger Stadium to go to all 81 home games, and the book isn't so much about the baseball that took place there, but about the relationships that developed in that place. A friend told me my real story is how my marriage survived that, but it's certainly, I've attended a whole lot of games in my life. It's played a crucial part in my life, and it's been the location for so many of my wonderful memories with my father and my uncles, men who grew up in Detroit and used to, rooted for the 35 Tigers, and used to tell me stories about Charlie Gehringer and Hank Greenberg and Babe Ruth coming to town. So yeah, it's an important part of the story for me.
What is it about baseball that's caused so many of us to be attracted to it, that's made it our national pastime?
I think part of it is that there are relationships intertwined with baseball. One of the things that people don't like about baseball, people who aren't huge baseball fans complain that, it's too slow of a game, but it's that slow, it's that slowness of the game, it's that pace that allows you to go to a ballpark and actually get to know the person you're with. You actually spend time speaking and coming to learn more about that person, and I think that's an important part of it.
I know that while you were writing The Final Season, you had access to Tiger Stadium and some of the players. Talk about that a little bit.
Some of the Tigers that we think most fondly of were guys I had encounters with and interviewed that season, so it was a special time for me. Any nice thoughts, for example, that you have of Ernie Harwell, you can just multiply them.
Nice.
I was down on the field early in the season, and he recognized that I was out of place. I wasn't one of the beat reporters for the Free Press or News. And he spotted me on the field, came up to me, introduced himself, and kind of took me under his wings for that year. And there was such a privilege. I've interviewed as a journalist some famous people, from Elton John to I've talked with Hillary Clinton and Mike Wallace, but I never felt as nervous as when I saw Al Kaline sitting alone on the bench at Tiger Stadium. I'm trying to muster up the courage to approach this guy I've idolized all my life, and I sit down next to him on the bench. It's just the two of us. Nobody else is around. He used to come to the park early before the gates would open, so that he could just sit there and he'd be looking out into the field. And these old movies, I imagined, were running in his mind. But I mustered the courage, sat down next to him, and broke the silence. And what really helped was when I asked him about his dad, and he just melted a little bit and started telling me about growing up in Baltimore. We didn't become best friends as I might have hoped when I was a kid, but it was a special moment.
Can you generalize that people were receptive to you being down there and writing the story? Did you run into any problems? Or?
I don't think they knew precisely what I was doing, and they might have been a little bit leery. But
what slant you were going to take?
Yeah, and how they would be portrayed. But to their credit, they gave me a lot of freedom, and I can't imagine that there's anything they really would object to in there. It really is a love letter to a place and a time.
Well, I went on the website that you used to promote your materials, and you got such glowing reviews for that first book. I mean, a lot of people could really relate to it, I think.
Yeah, we were very fortunate. It really seemed to have struck a chord, and it led naturally to the book that followed it.
Now, the book, The Road to Cooperstown. Talk about your memories of writing that book, and what was it like to actually go to Cooperstown?
The Road to Cooperstown is also a memoir. Both of the first two books were personal stories revolving around baseball, but they're family stories and stories that I think will resonate with other people. But when I was a boy, in 1972, an 11-year-old, I was dreaming of going to Cooperstown, which is where the Baseball Hall of Fame is located. And I was obsessed with this notion. Pestered my dad throughout that summer, but my mom ended up having brain surgery that year, and so we couldn't make the trip. And we'd talk about it in the years following, going to Cooperstown, always intending to someday make it. And lo and behold, almost 30 years had passed. When the final season came out and it won the Casey Award, the Hall of Fame invited me to speak.
Oh, nice.
Which gave me the opportunity to invite my father, who is now in his 80s, to make this road trip with me. And that's what the Road to Cooperstown is about. It's about a long-delayed journey to the Hall of Fame in Cooperstown.
Oh, nice.
And it's about the relationships that in our family tie us together, and baseball is a crucial part of that. There are family stories, but there are also baseball stories, and in my case, the two intermingle very much. My favorite moment in the Hall of Fame, maybe I can share that and just give you a sense of how the personal kind of intertwines with the historic. My dad grew up in Detroit, as I mentioned, and he played sandlot ball in the 30s. And one of the guys who was a superstar in the sandlot fields was this guy named Harold Newhouser. And my dad, Newhouser was known even as a 17 or 18-year-old because he was a hard-throwing American Legion pitcher who everybody knew had a future. And my dad ended up in this scrimmage game against the famous Hal Newhouser, who was just a kid at this point. And my dad got a couple of bloop doubles off of Newhouser, broke up this supposed no-hitter, and I clung to this story as a kid because, if my dad could get a couple hits off of Newhouser, who would go on and, be an MVP in the American League and face Ted Williams and Joe DiMaggio, then there might be hope that I could make it to the major league. So this story was an important part of my childhood. And we're in the Hall of Fame, and there are several parts to the Hall of Fame. There's a library, which is a wonderful research library. There's the museum, which tells the history of the sport, and then there's the Hall of Fame itself, which is really a gallery of plaques, almost a spiritual place. It's quiet. You walk in there, and my dad is standing in front of Hal Newhouser's plaque when we're in there. And there's this little kid off to the side, and he's wearing a Boston Red Sox Nomar Garcia para jersey, and he's about 8 or 9 years old. And my dad is deaf. He cannot, I have to speak very loudly for him to hear me. And so I'm like yelling in his ear in this very quiet building, "Are you thinking about the time you broke up Hal Newhouser's no-hitter?" And this little kid's head turns toward my dad's, and I hear him scamper across the floor in the Hall of Fame, and he tells his dad, he points to my dad, and he says, "That guy is in the Hall of Fame." And of course, my dad never played in the major leagues, but the Hall of Fame is built on a myth that Abner Doubleday invented baseball in Cooperstown, which never happened. So I figured, what's one more myth? Let the kid think my dad's in the Hall of Fame.
That's nice.
Kind of felt he deserved to be there anyways.
Very nice.
Yeah. I came upon this letter that Ty Cobb had written to his son. Ty Cobb has this reputation of being a pretty mean cuss, and he was in a lot of ways. But it's this letter where you can tell he's concerned about his son and the direction he's taken, and wants to keep him on the straight and narrow, and is having a whole lot of trouble doing it. And so
do as I say, not as I do.
yeah, that's right. And so there are all sorts of discoveries to be made there. But when you go into a place like that, you're going to get the history of something. But what I didn't expect so much is that as I went through the museum, parts of it would be triggering my own history. You'd see Mickey Mantle, and then you would think back to that Sandlot field and your brother playing and you yearning to be on the field with him. Or you'd see Charlie Gehringer and remember some stories that your uncle had told, or you'd see something on Babe Ruth and it'd trigger a memory of another relative or a neighbor that you hadn't thought of in years. And so I think that's what makes that place so special.
Well, since we're talking about the museum, is there anything that you were surprised to see there, or you were surprised to see was omitted from the museum?
To see Joe Jackson's, bat there, and to see something from Pete Rose's career. And so, that was a minor surprise. One of the neat surprises is that the guy who runs the Hall of Fame is a Detroit Tiger fan and a former Michiganian, Dale Petrosky. And so if you're a Tiger fan and you go to the Hall of Fame, you have to look up Dale. I'm sure he'll do something special for you.
Now, tell us about your new book. What's the name of it, and how did it come about?
Yeah,
What's the name of the book?
It's called Hank Aaron and the Home Run That Changed America, and it focuses on an 18-month period during which Hank Aaron is on a quest to pass Babe Ruth as the all-time home run king. It takes place primarily in 1973 and 1974. And, some folks may remember that Aaron, as he's pursuing Ruth's record, he's playing for the Atlanta Braves, the only Southern team, at a time when Georgia had a lieutenant governor who was a segregationist. And there were a lot of people in America who didn't want Hank Aaron, an African American, to break the record of the legendary Babe Ruth. And so, it's a lot to do with his enduring adversity and overcoming it, and continuing this chase no matter what came in his way.
How was the state of our society reflected at that time?
He was inundated with hate mail and death threats, and the threats were so serious that the FBI, for example, had agents disguised as maintenance workers following one of his daughters at college to prevent her abduction. I mean, the threats were so serious the team had bodyguards watching out for Hank Aaron. They had, when they'd be on the road traveling, they'd have two rooms, one under his name, which would be the decoy room, and another under a pseudonym. They even had a separate hideaway for him at spring training in 1974, because every game he played in every series there were threats that he would be killed. I don't think most of America felt that way, but that's the segment he was hearing from, and it's unfortunate.
What type of planning or preparation goes into a book like The Road to Cooperstown?
You go back to the original reporting 30 years ago, and you start there, and then you do interviews with people who were integral parts of it. I did talk with Hank Aaron, not in terms of interviewing him for the book, because he had done his autobiography 13 or 14 years ago. So he didn't want to do that. He didn't want to sit down for hours of interviews, but he did open the door for me to speak with everybody who was close to him, and which was a great opportunity. But one of the relationships that is, just so symbolic of the kind of man he is, relates to this gentleman he came to know in 1967. This is a young African-American player living in California, and he was drafted by the Atlanta Braves. And his mother did not want him to go down to the South in '67 to play for the Braves. She was worried about the civil rights dissension and the danger to him personally. So at a workout in Los Angeles, she corners Hank Aaron, this mother of the 17-year-old, and gets him to promise that if her son is drafted by the Braves, that he will watch over him as if he's his own son. And lo and behold, Hank Aaron agrees, takes this young man into his house. The kid is closer in age to his children than Hank Aaron, feeds him, watches over him as he progresses through the minor leagues, and he's on deck in 1974 when Hank Aaron hits the home run that breaks Babe Ruth's record. And that gentleman, all these many years later, is the manager of the Chicago Cubs, Dusty Baker. And Baker was just one of many sources I talked to. And Baker says, my players complain sometime that I can't give a pep talk without mentioning Hank Aaron, that quest and what he meant to me personally. And it, you get those stories whenever you talk to Hank Aaron's friends. I mean, he's just such a quiet, decent, respectful individual that you don't hear a sour word about him. And I think it's unfortunate. He still hasn't got all the attention he deserves, in my view. I do a lot of speaking engagements, and especially when I speak to children, I'll ask, how many of you have heard of Babe Ruth? Even now, 50 years after his death, most of the hands that grow up in the room, they know who Babe Ruth is. How many of you heard of Hank Aaron? And probably less than a fourth or a fifth of the hands go up. And he's the home run champion, but even now, I don't think a lot of people realize it. And, at a certain point, growing up, that record was considered the Mount Everest of sports records.
Let's back up a little bit. We've talked a lot about baseball. Let's talk some more about books. You've been involved with books all your life, it seems like, as an owner of a newspaper, as a reporter, as an editor. Tell us a little bit about what was involved in writing your books.
A little bit different for the first two, The Final Season and The Road to Cooperstown, because they were personal stories, they're memoirs. And though you do a lot of research for memoirs, you're dealing with your own memories, and you don't have to hit the library quite as much because you're relying on the memories of yourself and friends and family. When you do a book like the Hank Aaron book, I'm not part of the Hank Aaron book, I'm a journalist in this case, reporting this third person and uncovering tidbits people maybe didn't know and trying to present it as a compelling story that people want to read and will read. What's different though is you have to, in nonfiction, you have to have very much the straight and narrow. You're focused on the facts. It's an interesting story. You use literary devices to report it, but it comes back to the facts. You have to make sure those right. One of the challenges is when you're dealing with people who are remembering something 30 years ago, is that their memories have kind of become glossed over, and they don't always have them accurate. I can't tell you how many times I talked to former ball players who would tell me, well, I remember Hank Aaron coming up in the 9th inning, 2 outs, the bases loaded, hitting this home run, and always they remember the most dramatic home runs, but you go back and check the facts, and well, maybe the home run really was in the 7th inning and nobody was on base, and so you have to do a lot of fact checking, and so that's one of the challenges of writing these kinds of books.
I've spoken to a lot of authors over the course of this show, and they're all at varying stages in their career. Some are self-published, some have found editors, some of them are looking for publishers. Talk about that process for you.
But I was reading a book of essays by one of my favorite writers, Andre Dubus, and in it he had this beautiful story about this tradition he had with his agent of going to Fenway Park for opening day in Boston every day for 20 years. And he mentioned his agent's name, and I knew instantly that was the guy I wanted to represent this book. And ignorance can be blissful in some cases, because this guy has represented all sorts of New York Times bestsellers. And I just wrote him a letter. And I told him what I had in mind, that I wanted to go to all the games in that final season at Tiger Stadium. And would he consider representing the book? And he wrote back and said, I have a very full client list, and I've vowed not to take anybody else on, so I'm sorry, write back to me in six months if you don't find somebody else. And I wrote back instantly. I said, no, I want you to represent this. And he took me on, a guy named Philip Spitzer. And, we had difficulty selling the project at first, actually, because it was based in Detroit.
But he took an interest in your book?
Oh, he did, yeah. And so he started shopping it to major publishers in New York. And we ended up with St. Martin's Press, TomStanton Books. And they published the first 2 books, The Final Season of The Road to Cooperstown, and they were outbid for the Hank Aaron book by HarperCollins, William Morrow. So I'm very fortunate. I'm with major publishers and have a major agent, and there's film interest in 2 of the books, and 2 of them have been optioned. Maybe they'll become movies, maybe they won't, but they've been optioned anyways. And I just feel very fortunate. I've been on tour. I recently came off of a 10-state tour. We were in New York doing national publicity and all sorts of other places.
What are you doing right now to promote your books?
It varies, depending on the book and the time. But with the Hank Aaron book, for example, the book came out prior to the 30th anniversary of Hank Aaron breaking the record. And so you have lots of potential news angles. It's easier to get on the national shows at that point, and so we ended up on lots of the national sports shows and tons of national radio and national newspaper. This month we were picked by Reader's Digest as the pick of the month for
congratulations.
for the the current issue, and so it's thrilling. And HarperCollins, of course, has a huge promotional budget, and they've been very generous with me in terms of getting me places and getting the attention, and hopefully the book will fulfill the dreams they have for it too.
Mm-hmm. Do you have any other books underway?
I'm not sure what the next book is going to be. I'm not sure if it's going to be baseball even. We might vie away from that when you've had a little bit of success. And I mean, it's not major success I've had. I don't want to mislead anybody.
Mm-hmm.
But I've had some success with it, and the publishers are inclined to entice you to write another baseball book. They make it attractive to do that. And so I'm sure that's going to be there. But I'm not sure whether I'm going to do another baseball book or go off in another direction. I'm looking at a lot of options, most likely nonfiction. I don't have any background in fiction, so I don't see myself doing that initially.
Mm-hmm.
But I may do something that's a little more broader historically and not focused on baseball. I mean, for me, sports was how I accessed books.
Did you collect memorabilia as well?
Oh, I did, of course.
Talk about that.
The baseball. I mean, I still have my baseball cards. 100,000 baseball cards up in one of my son's closets. He kind of resents, I think, that his closet is overtaken by these cards. But oh no, I definitely have my ball cards. I still have packs of cards that I haven't opened from the 1970s. Wow. So, and I think I'll return to those someday. But yeah, I was one of those kids who would send off, for the autographed pictures, write the letters to the players, and I did a lot of that. And actually, it's part of the reason the first book came to be. I used to write these letters to the Tigers. I ended up on their mailing list, and every winter you'd get this glorious brochure from the Tigers, a color brochure on season ticket packages. And it had very much a blue-collar upbringing, and we couldn't afford to buy a season ticket package. But I vowed someday that when I was wiser than my father, I would buy one of these 81-game season ticket packages and go to the entire home season. And lo and behold, the years just kind of rolled away until 1999, and it was announced that the Tigers would be spending their last day at Tiger Stadium. I decided, if I'm going to do this, I'm going to have to do it now.
Mm-hmm. Well, as you've gotten older, are there any books that you've read for pleasure, and any authors that come to mind?
Oh, yeah. I mean, I mentioned Willie Morris. Willie Morris is one of my favorite authors. He passed away a few years ago. And I love how he's able to evoke certain times and a sense of place.
I'm totally unfamiliar.
Yeah,
Can you talk about him?
Sure. Yeah, he's a Mississippi writer, and he just really captures the South of his time of upbringing, which would have been probably the 30s, 40s. Actually, even a little, mainly the 40s. And he just really captures the spirit of a time and place, and so I admire that and his ability to do that. I've read lots of memoirs more recently, from some of the more common ones like The Liars Club by Mary Carr to Mitch Albom's, of course, Tuesdays with Maury, to ones that would be a little more obscure as well. And and I look for books that touch my heart, and I hope I can write books like that. And I think for most of that means, for most people, that means those are books that revolve around relationships. It's not that relationships I've had are so different from the relationships other people have had. They're not, but I hope that readers are able to see themselves in these books.
Well, Tom, we've spent a lot of time talking about books and writing and publishing. Do you have any hobbies or other interests?
Music is a hobby as well. Actually, I don't usually count this first book. I had a book before the final season, which was an Elton John related book, and I used to publish the International Elton John magazine and run his international fan expo. So,
so that would be that.
I don't. My sons all do. They got that from their mom. I wish I could play an instrument. I have no talents in that regard, but I love music. I'm actually flying to Las Vegas next month to see him perform, so it's still a bit of a passion.
I know there are a lot of would-be authors that watch the show. Do you have any advice for them?
Just persist. When we were first shopping the final season, we had many editors based in New York who said, told my agent, if this book were set in Yankee Stadium or Fenway Park in Boston, then it would be a national book, but this is Detroit and it's Tiger Stadium, and that's kind of regional. And my agent disagreed and I disagreed, and we did mold the book a little bit. You know, we came back and took their concerns to heart and you know, made it more of a father-son story, more of a memoir.
A little broader, you mean?
Yes, but you know, I probably received 30 rejections, or my agent did. He actually insulated me from some of those. He'd send them to me occasionally, but he didn't want me to get too demoralized. And it wasn't, you know, when we went back out with the manuscript completed, we decided at one point that we were going to stop trying to sell the book based on proposal, which is how you sell a nonfiction book. You usually write a sample chapter and a proposal. And so we decided to, well, since we were getting rejected because of this being a regional kind of themed book, we'd wait until the book was, you know, until I had a manuscript to shop. Mm-hmm. And we got nice blurbs. Blurbs are the comments that better known people offer for, you see them often on the back of a book, you know, that they'll say nice things about an author's work. And you know, we were fortunate to get them from Sparky Anderson and Ernie Harwell and Elmore Leonard and Bob Costas. And then we started shopping the book, and that's when it, you know, the first set my agent sent out at that point, we got an offer. And so it really is to persist, you know, to believe in your dream and to pursue it. And you know, if it's your passion, I think it'll come to be for you if you have some talent.
Let's change the subject from books and writing. What's your feeling about the Tigers this year?
Well, I'm much more proud to say I'm a Tiger fan this year than I was last year when we almost set the record for most losses. And actually, people I deal with in other parts of the country, they seem much more respectful of the Tigers this year. And I've been down there to see several games this year. So it's, you know, I'm a Tiger fan no matter what, no matter how they perform. But it's you know, it's nice to have a competitive team and to have some world-class players, especially Ivan Rodriguez. It's just bringing a lot of joy back to the ballpark, I think.
Watch any other sports?
Yeah, sure, the Pistons. Had a great time being a Pistons fan. You know, just kind of world champions all around. I think we're the envy of a lot of people.
If a writer wants to find an agent or an editor or publisher, what's your advice to them? How can they go about finding the right people to work with?
And in terms of finding an agent, I would look to books similar to the one that you're working on, similar to the ones you dream of writing. Check the acknowledgement sections. Usually authors always thank their agents. And you know, use that as a way to start a conversation with that agent. Don't call them. Agents hate to be called, I found. Just write a very compelling letter to them. Tell them what it is about the work that they've agented that you've admired, and just kind of take it from there. Do your research, because there are thousands of agents. Sometimes you can meet agents at writers' conferences, but really, I would do the research, and I would, you know, look for agents who focus on the types of work that you want to write, because they're going to know the editors in that area much better than if you just have a general agent who's sending out stuff blindly to a lot of editors he or she doesn't know. And so start there and write a compelling letter that it, you know, makes it difficult for the agent not to respond to you. And you know, if you have an agent of a certain caliber, that person is going to have access to editors. He or she will know the editors, who's looking for what, who's interested in what, and it just expedites the whole process, makes it much less of a blind process. You know, whereas if you're trying to do it yourself, sending out letters to editors, you know, without an agent, I mean, that's such an obstacle to overcome. I know some people have had success self-publishing, but unless you have a specific audience that you know you can reach that route, it's very difficult to succeed in that way. I mean, there are stories of people who do beat the odds, like the Chicken Soup for the Soul guys who self-published, but for most people it's not a good route. So I try to find the agent and let the agent find an editor at a publishing house.
Something I forgot to ask you earlier. Have you done the book fair, book signing circuit?
Yeah, I've done some of that. I was, Ann Arbor had its first book fair earlier this year. I was there. I've done the Chicago Book Festival. I've done a few others too, and done lots of book signings and still am at bookstores. It's crucial to have relationships with people who sell books, and so I have great relationships with, you know, booksellers across the country, particularly in Michigan, where you know, the first book was a bestseller, and so I have some great relationships with bookstore owners.
Tom, thanks a lot for making the time to come and be on the Author's Den today.
Well, thanks, Mike. It's been my pleasure. It's a great time.
Success with all your books, too.
Thank you.
Thank you.